welcome today to our session on Woody Meadows. My name is Misty Spire. I'm the team leader of nature education here at Green Adelaide, and this is our third instalment of our webinar series for 2025, which we're running to help share the great work happening across Adelaide to make it cooler, greener, wilder and more climate resilient. I'd also like to start by acknowledging the country that we're coming to you all from, the lands of the Kaurna people, Ngadalul Tampanthi, Ngadalul Kaurna, Yatanga, Imparenti, which translates to we acknowledge that we're meeting on Kaurna country today. I am 4 stories up, but it's good to remind ourselves and ground ourselves in the history of our landscapes and what they mean to First Nations today and how we work together with them to care for them. And it's a privilege to do that with Kaurna here in Adelaide. This session is being recorded and will be available on the Green Adelaide YouTube channel afterwards. We've got stacks of you jumping in right now, which is fantastic. But for those people in your networks that don't make it today, please point them to our YouTube channel. And we've got all of our sessions since we started this series back in 2024. You're invited to ask questions at any time during today's sessions by putting them into the chat, or there's a Q&A function as well now within Teams, and we'll answer as many of these as we can in the session. As I mentioned before, we're looking at Woody Meadows, a new approach to low maintenance urban landscapes, and we have got Professor Claire Farrell with us today. And I'm just going to pop through to the second, the outline, so that you're aware of how we'll run things today. So we're really keen to think about this innovative approach to creating low maintenance urban landscapes. And this concept has been developed by Claire and her team at the University of Melbourne. Claire will share key insights from more than a decade of research and trials. She'll walk us through the thinking behind the project, the process, the science, the design and the lessons learned along the way, as well as what this approach can offer as part of a broader urban greening strategy here in Adelaide. We know that urban greening is a priority for many of you that are online today, whether you're from Adelaide or further afield, and we're looking forward to learning how Woody Meadows might expand the toolkit of sustainable, beautiful and low maintenance planting options available to landholders, to planners and also communities alike. So let's welcome Claire and jump into the presentation. Thanks so much for joining us today, Claire.
Thanks,
I'll
Christy,
stop sharing and let you.
Thank you for such a beautiful introduction. And I echo that I'm on the lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung today, and also pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. And I think for all of us working in the space of planting and being on country, it's such a special thing. So Woody Meadows, some of you might have heard about these things, and I'm going to go through them and what we've learnt and I guess opportunities for using them in different contexts. Hopefully by the end of this you really understand that they're a very flexible approach, and they're applicable in a lot of different settings and using lots of different plants. And I would also like to, I guess, start from the perspective of just talking about the team that's come together to bring Woody Meadows to be a part of our cities across Australia. So we now have Woody Meadows in Melbourne, where they started, in Hobart, in Canberra, in Sydney and in Perth. And as you'll notice, we kind of skipped over South Australia, so apologies for that. But as a result, it's a very big team, and we've collaborated with James Hitchmore in Sheffield, where the process really started, but also Murdoch University in Western Australia and researchers at Melbourne. And I'd really like to highlight my close colleague, John Rayner, because he's really guided Woody Meadows through their whole pathway with myself, and also Dr. Rachel Bathgate, who's our knowledge translation person on the project. And so Woody Meadows, they are an innovative, low maintenance and resilient approach to greening cities. And of course, all of us would have probably written grants or read things that say all these words together and don't necessarily mean them. But when we developed Woody Meadows, it was really thinking how we could take these monocultures that, pass for low maintenance landscapes increase their diversity and their beauty, but without increasing the inputs to them. So that's really where it started, and our focus was always on that low maintenance and having resilience through diversity. And clearly we're all very familiar with low maintenance plantings, that yes, they might be low maintenance, but it doesn't mean that they really do much, and they certainly don't look great. And their lack of diversity means that often they fail, and then they're full of weeds and all those kind of things as well. And some of these come down to access, so difficult to get to places to maintain safely, but also inappropriate plant selection, maybe insufficient plant densities to make them keep weeds out, and all of those things together. And so to kind of get around that and create something that could be meadow-like, and the botanist in the room would go, you can't be a woody meadow, and that's true. These do take their inspiration from temperate climate meadow plantings in cities, which are diverse, and they're maintained through mowing to regenerate them. And so for us, we needed a perennial, robust planting for that. So we were inspired by Australian heathlands and shrubland communities, where they're a diverse mix of native trees and shrubs, and I'll get into plants a little bit more in a bit. They're low maintenance in that the inputs are equivalent to something like Glamandra or saltbush monocultures, and we use we use coppicing as our way to regenerate them. So instead of mowing a herbaceous meadow or grassland like you would do in temperate climates, we use coppicing to take away the above ground foliage and to mimic fire that's so prevalent in our Australian heathlands and shrublands, to maintain diversity and to regenerate them. They're also layered, and this is the example from Birang Ma, which is now 10 years old. This is shortly after its first coppicing, and they're designed to have, I guess, a variety of layers. So a ground covering layer where most of the plants are, a middle layer with a few less kind of species and plants, and then a very scattered emergent or upper layer. And the layering is key to getting good ground coverage and maximising diversity, but it's also key for it to not end up looking like a giant hedge. And so we achieve low maintenance in these plantings through a combination of using inorganic growing media. So for us in Melbourne, most of the time this is scoria, and this becomes the planting media and the mulch, and it has the benefit of being weed-free at planting. We plant very densely, so 6.25 plants a square metre, and that's in contrast to, I guess, most monoculture kind of low maintenance plantings where it might be 1 or 2 plants a square metre. And we coppice every 2 to 4 years. And this coppicing, cutting off very low, so 10 to 20 centimetres above the soil surface, means that we get dense plantings with lots of stems, which means we get lots of flowers, but it also maintains diversity. So it helps to interfere with that community after 2 years to stop the really robust plants taking over and minimising diversity. It means we kind of reset it and everything gets to reshoot again. And so it is a dramatic change with removing most of the biomass of a plant. And you can see here with this example that's just had its second coppicing in this photo, and you can see all of the stems that came from the first coppicing, and they'll multiply for the next one. So the scoria I talked about is an 8 millimetre crushed rock. And so what this means is it's all parts of the rock fraction that would go through an 8 millimetre sieve. So it's some 8 mil aggregate, but it's lots of fines. And these fines are critical. They provide a growing media for the plants to grow in, so the tube stock's planted into this. We usually use a depth of 200 mil, but sometimes it could be 100 mil that's used if there's underlying sand and it's free draining. But by having this overlay rip subsoil and weed-free kind of sprayed out or scalped sites, it means that you're giving the plants a free draining growing media that's weed-free to get established. And the Woody Meadows, they started as a pilot project with the City of Melbourne, and the Birang Ma site is one of them. The other was Royal Park. And it was also funded partly by the Trawella Foundation. And we did this research in collaboration with James and also Royal Botanic Gardens in Cranbourne to see what plants would work in this kind of idea and how they would respond to coppicing. At that point, we really didn't know whether it would even work or whether we would have high-profile disaster. And this work was published as guidelines for the City of Melbourne, which are on our website. And essentially, woody meadows are planted as tube stock at that tight density, so 6.25 plants a square metre or 400 mil centres if you prefer to think of it that way. And with this one, they were copper 6 months after planting, but now we tip prune at planting and then recommend coppicing every 2 years. And you can see here this cycle. So planting and its, I guess, initial tip pruning that we would do now. A year after coppicing, we have canopy closure and we have those layers forming. Then coppicing at 2 years, you can see it's a pretty big intervention. But 1 month after, we've got flowers and quite a lot of green coverage. 6 months later, we're back to almost where we were before coppicing. And then you can see John here for scale. 2 years later, we're a pretty big jungle, and then we go to coppice. So as I said, those guidelines have what happened with this project and are fairly good. We're about to publish our Woody Meadow guidelines that are more comprehensive than this, but it is a good insight into that project. And so with coppicing, this site has been coppiced 3 times now at that sort of bigger level. And each time, obviously, there's a pretty big change. The species diversity does go down over time because of the big plants that were used here. And the other thing with coppicing is to think about how it varies with its age of planting. So early on, it's hand tools, it's secateurs, it's loppers. When the plants are bigger, you can use brush cutters with sharp blades or hedge trimmers. Then you might use smaller chainsaws when they're bigger still. But the idea around woody meadows and coppicing was to eventually think about it at scale with things like flail mowers on tractors and things like that. So equivalent to what you would do to manage, I guess, fire breaks or view lines in heathland plantings generally. And so with this demonstration site, we were able to show that woody meadows were highly aesthetic and they could recover from the coppicing, but also that they are dynamic plantings. So what's planted at day 1 is not what's going to be there in year 10. And our challenge after that was really to go, well, okay, it works there in those 2 locations, but how can we get this to work along railway sidings, roadsides, parks, and maybe even in water-sensitive urban design? And how does that take into account the layers and plant selection? And so we were very lucky to get an ARC linkage grant, so a government research grant with co-investment from 8 partners, which included Vic Roads, a water utility, and 6 councils. And so with that, for the last 4 years, we've been relating plant performance to selection and different woody meadow planting designs. And we've also been quantifying the maintenance and the inputs. Now, in between, I guess, going for the grant with those 8 partners and being awarded it, we had lots of people come to us and say they would really like to try out woody meadows and get them to happen. So we, with the partners, I guess, endorsement, we created the Woody Meadow Network. And this is now a network of 30 plus partners who contribute financially to the design of a woody meadow, and then they become part of the broader project, sharing outcomes and learnings across the whole. And part of that included the level crossing removal projects in Melbourne. Now, so this has been quite a significant state government infrastructure associated with the big build to convert roadside level crossings into either going above roads, under roads, or diverting them entirely to create new train stations. And with this, the sustainability lead for one of the the corridors of transport, because they divided it up north, south, east, west, and all of that kind of thing, was really keen on Woody Meadows and saw an opportunity to make some guidelines so that they could be installed close to railway infrastructure. And if any of you have worked with either roads or rail, you know that the last thing any project engineer wants is plants anywhere near that infrastructure. So to get this document that was endorsed at a organisation level to say that if level crossings had Woody Meadows, the project teams would get sustainability bonus at completion, but they would also, I guess, almost get a sign of approval as they went to overcome some of those project barriers. And so this was a real game changer for us. And you can see some of them here. So they range from sort of civic station plaza kind of plantings, pocket parks along roadsides, and also linear corridors along walking tracks and things like that. And so with all these sites and project partners, as well as research at Burnley into coppicing response of plants, we've looked at over 280 different plant species across Australia and Woody Meadows. And so, as I said, those plantings in Perth and Canberra and Sydney as well. And these are all native tree and shrub species. But there tends to be an emphasis on local or indigenous species in Perth and Sydney, and that mirrors their local ecosystems, which are really shrub dominated, versus in Melbourne, where we have grasslands as our predominant vegetation type around Melbourne. And what we've found is really, regardless of a plant's fire response strategy, so whether it's a reseeder or a resprouter, most Australian plants, woody plants, will respond to coppicing and resprout. And this has been a bit of a game changer for us because it means that you don't necessarily need to wait for research on a plant to know that it might work in a woody meadow. You can kind of take a best bet that it's probably going to work. And the reason that the fire response is so different to the coppicing response is because obviously you're still leaving 10 or 20 centimetres of stem there for plants to resprout from, whereas in fire you might be removing the whole biomass. I guess the other thing with coppicing that's super important is that it's such a dramatic change. And this is one of my favourite examples, probably not for the council where it happened, but for me it is. This is a pocket park we did in an area close to a school, close to the trams, as you can see, and also somewhere where it was kind of abused. You know, people, when they moved out, they'd leave their couches there. There was some unsociable behaviour that would happen there as well. And then when the council put the Woody Meadow in there, the response by people who walked by it or lived locally was so huge that when they coppiced it, they got all this abuse, and the council shared that with me, and it was quite, you know, illuminating. It was things like, how could you put in this beautiful planting and then you've not known what you've done, and you've had hacks go in and just chop it all back and have no horticultural skills whatsoever. And so really this comes down to signage. So you need to put a sign to explain to people what coppicing is and why you're doing it. And of course, you know, this planting grew back more magnificent within a couple of months after that event. But for me, it's a positive story because it really shows that you can enrich an area with plants and people really will respond to that. So I guess the other place that's really expanded since the first pilot project is thinking about alternatives to scoria. So what can we plant woody meadows in that'll work in a similar way, but not have the issues with being a mined product, which scoria is, and also being highly regional. So if you're outside of Victoria and even really outside of Melbourne, it's really difficult to get scoria. So we've just been working on a project to do a roundabout in Shepparton, sort of in northern Victoria, and we've had to look at alternatives even for that because they're not close to scoria as a source. So we've done crushed sandstone, so anything below 20 mil aggregate in Sydney, and we've looked at crushed concrete in experiments at Burnley. So, sorry, Burnley is the University of Melbourne where I'm based. And so this is Claire Kennefick's PhD where she had been growing woody meadow plants in either 5, 10 or 20 centimetre deep crushed concrete. So this is crushed concrete, including the fines, and seeing if they would grow. Now, she grew a mix of shrubs because she was interested in whether plants that came from naturally alkaline soils would cope better with the, very low pH, or very high, if you want to look at it that way, pH of crushed concrete. So we're talking pH of 12, so very, very alkaline. And what she found was that most plants didn't mind, but there's a few like Darwinia citriodora, which went very chlorotic and they didn't love life. But things like the Aleogyne huglei or Eucalyptus pulverenta were quite happy. The other thing, as I said, we were looking at different contexts, and with that, woody meadows are still layered. So as I said, with the Biro and Ma, where you had a base, a middle, and then an upper layer, and that might be something at that size and scope you'd use to screen a sound wall along a freeway. We're also doing that layered approach with things like roundabouts, where the upper plants might be to 500 or 600 millimeter tall plants. But in that case, it's usually 2 layers. So we might have a base layer that's from 0 to 300 mil high, and then the upper middle layer that goes to 600. And to just give you a sense of what that looks like in terms of the numbers of species and composition. So for a 2 meter tall woody meadow, the upper layer is the fewest plants, but we still use as many species as we can. So in this example, we have 4 species and they make up 2% of the mix. For the middle layer, we might be looking at 1 to 1.5 meter high plants. It's roughly 30% of the mix and there's 5 species. And the base layer makes up 70%. They're species sort of around 70 centimeters, if you like. 6 species, and you can see here with the dots on the right, there's in a 2 by 2 meter plot, there's 1 of the upper, there's 6 of the mid, and the rest are all base layer plants and randomly allocated. In terms of a specification, it looks something like this, where again, the base layer is the most number of plants, so 70% of a planting mix, or in this case, 600 plants. For the middle layer, it's 30 or 230 plants for this 130 square meter planting. And the upper layer is 2% or 16 plants in this planting. And look, diversity is your key to being able to design a woody meadow that will be resilient, but also offer you a way of experimenting. So in most plantings, we'll put a higher percentage within a layer of plants we know do really well and are going to work pretty much in any woody meadow. And then we'll put a couple that we really don't know what's going to happen, but through having the high plant density and the diversity, if they did die, it's not a really big deal. And in this planting, one of the ones that we really tried here, well, actually a couple, were the Eremophila glabra, the prostrate form, and a shrub form of Hardenbergia violacea. And both of them were a huge success here, but we were prepared for them to fail. In terms of planting, because it is random, it can be a challenge to lay it out because you don't draw a diagram with the location of every plant. You use those percentages of the mix to know how many numbers are going to go into a site or a bed, and then you lay them out random. And the way to make sure that structurally it works with that randomness is to lay out the tallest plants first, so the upper layer, then come in with that middle layer, and then arrange the base around those. And that way you can also avoid things like overhead power lines or not have an upper layer plant right next to a path, and those kind of considerations in a sort of more intuitive way on site. And it doesn't matter with the base layer if you end up with 2 species that are the same next to each other. At the end of the day, you won't read it that way. Now, at some of the sites, especially the level crossings, randomness is really random. And we had situations like this where contractors would literally throw out all the tubes and then go and plant them. Surprisingly, it actually was not as horrendous as you think. So the most important layer to get right is the base layer, and that is why it's the highest percentage in terms of the mix. But with it, it's also important to think about plant form, because you do want, at its best, you want this meshing together multi-species carpet, for want of a better word. So ground covers like Scaevola or Gardenia ovata for us, you guys have another Gardenia as well, which would be worth trying in this situation, are really good, and they're great to have at quite high densities. Low small shrubs, good to think about their form. You don't want too many sort of upright columnar kind of plants. You want more spreading mounds, or things like the Eremophila here, which will have branches that will go through other things quite happily. And you can also think about using climbing plants that will have a prostrate form, or I guess climbers that could have a shrub form as well, like Hardenbergia. With the upper layer, this is generally one of the biggest constraints when you design a woody meadow. It's always best to start and think about what the maximum height of the planting is going to be. A lot of plantings we do will have a 1 metre maximum height because they're on a verge, or need to maintain sight lines, or they're going under street trees. So street trees basically become the tallest form in there. And so with this upper layer, the next kind of key question to ask is, are you going to copse them every 2 years? And whilst that's ideal, we do find that for people like Vic Roads, or for even metro trains, they might do the first coppicing at 2 years, because that falls within the handover period, where it's been maintained, and then it'll go to I guess Department of Transport, or will go to metro trains, and it probably won't ever get coppiced again. So in that case, we will use the mature heights as the maximum height to select that layer. But if we know that it is going to be coppiced every 2 years, we will look at things like the 5-year height. And we have that in a database for a lot of plants, but you can also find it online by reading things of native plant journals and those kind of things as well. The other way to get to have, I guess, more plants and be able to go within those height constraints as well is to think about cultivars. And so we use Allegheny huglei in pretty much every woody meadow. We will use the species forms that get to 2 to 3 metres for those larger park or freeway soundwall kind of screening woody meadows. But in verges and those kind of things, we'll use a cultivar like Misty. And yeah, I think cultivars are a really interesting thing, and I think these are going to really expand how we use native plants more broadly as people find selections that fit niches that we don't get with the species forms. And so, as I said before, prostrate versions of Gardenia ovata are great. For Agonis flexuosa in its species form, it can be a 16-metre high tree, but there are lower forms that are used for hedging and things like that. And those low mounding shrub forms of Hardenbergia are also brilliant. So like any planting, so woody meadows aren't a cut and paste list of plants that are planted in all of them. Each one has a site evaluation and a site selection matrix like any other planting that you would do. And so from climate, so the rainfall and the temperature extremes, light, so whether it's shaded or in full sun, exposure to wind and even slopes, that determines the physical tolerances of the plants. And then we use things like the height limitations and the area to think about plant size and the layers. And by area, what I mean with that is, if you were doing a big sloping site alongside a freeway, for example, then really sprawling, robust plants like Myroporum, viscosum, or insulaire, or Even Hibiscus scandens are brilliant, and salt bushes are great. But if I had a small woody meadow that might have a width of 3 meters, I wouldn't use any of those plants because they would just create a maintenance issue by going outside the edges too quickly. For irrigation, all woody meadows have to be irrigated through their first summer, regardless of when they're planted. So if you plant in autumn, you still have to irrigate through the first summer. And if you don't do this, you're just not setting them up for success, and it's really not worth the effort. And the other thing, I guess, that varies maintenance is access. So how often are you going to go in there to coppice or other things like that? They're largely experimental. So with our partners, they quite often would come with a question that they wanted to answer around woody meadows. And in the case of City of Greater Dandenong in Melbourne, they were really interested in site preparation techniques and whether scalping and different decompaction techniques made a difference, or whether spraying and not doing anything else worked. And for them, it actually didn't matter. All of these treatments performed equally well. So it just shows you, I guess, that scoria really overcomes a lot of site barriers. For Perth, we had Ali Babington, so now Dr. Ali Babington, who did her PhD on woody meadows there. So Ali had studied horticulture at Melbourne, but really wanted to go home and do a PhD in Perth. And so we did a collaborative project with Murdoch, which was really wonderful. And so she trialed a lot of local species because, I mean, why wouldn't you? I think in terms of Australian plant diversity, many of us would wish we were working with Western Australian plants. And again, very similarly to the work that we found in Melbourne, most plants would resprout after coppicing. And I guess the other interesting thing she found was she trialed plants that came from around Perth locally naturally and compared them to plants that came from further north in Geraldton, where it's hotter and drier, with the hypothesis that those plants that came from the hotter and drier climate would be potentially more drought tolerant and cope with both the conditions in a woody meadow better, but also resprout after coppicing. And it didn't matter, which I think is also interesting because we kind of think that it really matters where a plant comes from for how it performs, but our experience with woody meadows is that that's not the case at all. The other thing we've done in Perth, which has been really wonderful, is we worked on the East Subiaco redevelopment. So Subiaco Oval being turned into open space and parkland. And in that, we were able to work with Auntie Viv and think about what plants had connections with Noongar people in terms of their use and their medicine value, but also to be able to tell a story about fire and its importance through that coppicing. In Sydney, similarly, there's a real focus on local plant species, and with Karingai, which is quite a leafy treed suburb in council, in Sydney. They have their own nursery associated with the council, and so they grew all the plants for their woody meadows and planted them with volunteers. And so 16 local plant species were used, and it's in an electricity easement. And one of the nice things with this project, as well as activating a site that was pretty much a linear dog park with no infrastructure, was that when they did their coppicing, they actually took all of their cutting material back to the nursery and propagated more woody meadow plants. So a really nice closed loop story there, and used crushed sandstone as well. And so I guess through these examples and the broader network, what I'm really saying that we did with Woody Meadows is that we've grown a community of practice. And I think this has been quite a special part of the project. It's always been about sharing, and it's always been about knowledge exchange. And across all of the plantings and all of the different partners, we've learnt so much more than we would have if we'd had only the 8 partners. And also it's meant that, you know, if there was delays in one partner putting in a woody meadow, there was another one putting one in already, And so we learnt so much because each one, its successes and failures informed the next one. And so we've been able to eliminate a lot of the issues with them along the way. So in terms of quantifying maintenance, it was a key objective and actually something that I found quite surprisingly difficult to get data on, maintenance inputs of different plantings from our council partners. And so what we did was we took data from different councils on what they would do to maintain an edge, low maintenance planting with native Australian plants that would be weeded periodically with herbicide. It might be cut back every now and again, and it would be, I guess, visited quarterly to remove rubbish and things like that. And so that's at the top, the typical low maintenance planting. Then we had a seeded exotic wildflower meadow. So that's, one of those packet of seeds that would have lots of cosmos and zinnias and sunflowers and those kind of things. And then we had mown council turf, done at scale. And so we've just reported this all as hours because obviously everyone has different rates and all of those kind of things. And so whether it was 2 people for 10 hours or it was 1 person for 20 hours, it all kind of works out. And you can see that, over a 6-year period, what we would consider a low maintenance planting is not very low maintenance, in fact, and it's because of the frequency of visits that happen on a scheduled basis. And when we put Woody Meadows in there, like if you're able to talk back, I would ask you where you think they would sit. But what we found was they come out pretty much the same as mown turf. And, this is considering those 2 yearly coppicing where people have to go in, cut it all back and take it away versus, mowing every fortnight in summer and every, 3 weeks in the cooler season. Is pretty amazing to come out there. And, this is just thinking about our inputs. It's not thinking about chemicals. It's not thinking about, emissions and all of those kind of things. So this is a really good start to think about where we value maintenance and inputs more broadly. As part of Ali's PhD, she also looked at how people responded to plantings like Woody Meadows in verge situations and whether they liked them or preferred their lawn alternative. Now, because she is in Perth, they have a lot of these sort of estates that have very big verges outside of the sort of walls that fence them off. And so Ali, because this was at the start of her PhD, did this before she had a planting site. So it was digitally manipulated Woody Meadows, but based on, I guess, our experiences in Melbourne to make the assemblages quite accurate in terms of composition and layering. And she found that overall lawn was not preferred at all. And you can see here in the graph, lawn's really not preferred versus Woody Meadows that are highly preferred. And to Ali's credit, she had 985 people take part in this, which is pretty amazing. And people's preferences, they came down to a few factors. And so Ali tried Woody Meadows that had different variations in terms of layering and colour and flowering. And the most preferred were the ones that had the most complexity in terms of the layering structure. They had the most flowers and they liked the combination of grey and green foliage. And this is in contrast to work we've done before on green roofs where people really love green plants and they don't so much like grey plants visually in Melbourne. And what we think the difference here is that the grey in a woody meadow it's another colour contrast, so it's probably about variation in colour, but also some of the iconic plants in her images, like Eucalyptus macrocarpa, happen to be grey as well. And people ascribed all the benefits that we would associate with these things, so cooling, biodiversity, and drought resistance being better than lawn. So I guess the other really fabulous thing about Woody Meadows is just how they have grown from what was a pilot project in 2015/16 into something that with knowledge sharing, demonstration, and testing sites everywhere. We've up to 14,000 square meters with 51 different planting sites across Australia, and you can see there that in the last year we've had those first Sydney plantings going in, and we've also submitted a new linkage application which is under review at the moment for Sydney to focus on pollinators and people's preferences to Woody Meadows, and that's been led by Dr. Cara Thelful at Macquarie University. Our website is a big part of our knowledge sharing, and our guidelines that we have already are there, but as I said, we'll have new ones in July. And the other nice thing about them is that as people have built Woody Meadows, we've asked to share them on the website. So at this Woody Meadows planting in the bottom left here, you can go to any Woody Meadow and you can download a species list, and you can find out more about it and where it is. We're also lucky to just have had our first Woody Meadow at Burnley, so at the University of Melbourne campus, put in at the end of November, and that was a gift through Open Gardens Victoria, and it's been wonderful to have that on site to demonstrate them as well. And it just took a little bit of time to reflect what I guess Woody Meadows might mean for South Australia and for Adelaide more specifically, in terms of what we've learnt already and what the opportunities are. And just in terms of plant species, and I looked up some from your local grassy sort of plains, and they indicated these species being core to those, and all of these we know work in Woody Meadows. So it's a good start to being able to have a palette that's pretty robust and we know works, and then to build on with playing with more experimental things. And I love goodenias. They're just some of my favorites. And the goodenia that you guys have got, I haven't played with before, but it looked really exciting, and it looked a lot like our Scaevola calendulaceae, and so I'm sure it would be brilliant. In terms of substrates, so Nat shared with me a product from one of the local quarries, which looks to be suitable. And so in terms of particle size distribution with a mix of aggregate and fines, it looks really great, and the specification for that comes out well. But I think the things with these that we don't know about is just salinity and pH and what that might mean as well. So it's just a case of probably grabbing some and doing some tests on that. Yeah, again, just to thank all the partners that are involved, because as I said, it is a project that works from partnerships, and yeah, none of it would have happened without any of them. And thank you. And so I'll stop sharing and open it up to you all for questions.
Fantastic. Thanks, Claire. What a great overview, and yeah, lots of questions pinging around here. So we'll try and get through a few, and if we don't get to yours today, we will be following up with an email with all the links and information that Claire shared as well. So what an awesome project to now have 51 sites, and yeah, great to see it growing over time and all those awesome partnerships. Such a great example of how projects work in reality. So awesome to hear. There's quite a few questions around the scoria, so I'm not sure exactly how we'll tackle these, but I'll start with this one. Are there many issues with scoria retaining too much heat over the summer months and killing off newly planted seedlings? I'm assuming the requirement for irrigation is best kept minimal in these scenarios, but you did go on after this question, I think, to talk about the importance of irrigation actually in that first summer particularly.
Yeah, and you're right, it's not a huge amount of irrigation. We recommend whatever the council would do for a native planting. That's kind of our benchmark. So I think for Melbourne, it works out something like 25 millimetres a week is kind of what we sort of, or a fortnight we recommend. And however you deliver that doesn't matter. You can do it by hand or by truck or a system. You don't have to put in a system. That's not the case. The scoria, it is hotter, but what you're hoping for and happens in that first summer is canopy closure is pretty rapid because you've got that high planting density and that focus on plants with different forms. So those ground covers really mesh together pretty quickly. It's also really free draining. So if you did have excessive rain events, maybe you have one of those crazy things that we're getting now where we get 20 mil in 20 minutes of rainfall, you're not going to drown the plants either. Yeah, the use of scoria came from our green roof work, actually. So green roof substrates are pretty similar to that. It's just that we add a little bit of organic matter and a bit more aggregate to make them more free draining. But yeah, so it's a great substrate for plants.
Fantastic. And so, yeah, the next question kind of leads on to that. So the plants manage okay with the lack of organic matter in scoria, and or is it just that the plants that you've selected manage with low nutrients?
Yeah, so that's the thing. So you want to make the native plants grow better than the weeds. And so if you have organic matter, the weeds will be preferred. And if you don't, the native plants will. So think about these plants. They come from impoverished sands and low nutrient soils. So that's what they want. We do put some slow release fertilizer across the top, about a quarter of the lowest rate goes on at planting as a surface application.
Yeah, fantastic. And Steve's got a couple of questions here. Interesting. Okay, so it's more about I suppose the education of the maintenance team that look after these sites in terms of like the educational component about what plants are what and what are weeds and what's removed. Has there needed to be further education with maintenance staff as part of these pilots?
Yeah, pretty much every time. So most people attend like a talk like this and they go, oh yeah, that sounds great, makes total sense. And then you give them a pair of secateurs and they freak out. So pretty much every time we, go to site and we'll go, look, you've got to coppice them and this is how hard, because people, they balk at cutting a plant pretty low.
Yes.
So we do that, but what we're hoping is we've just made a whole heap of videos. And so that's going to be part of the guidelines, is basically videos stepping people through coppicing, but also laying out the plants as well. Look, the thing is, and the reality is, most of these sites are being maintained by people with no horticultural education whatsoever. And it is the reality on large infrastructure projects. So you can just do your best and try to have it. But we have had base layer plants weeded out by people who don't know the difference between a weed and a plant. And that's been quite unfortunate. But yeah.
Yeah. Everyone learning together, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yes, that is unfortunate. Yeah, but I'm sure it can happen. So yeah, so having some education up front and videos would be fantastic. Also, Steve was interested in the concept. Seems also excellent for people to apply in their own private yards as well. Has that kind of been taken up? Have you got any kind of anecdotal conversations around that, or has that been like an education piece that some councils have taken up as they've gone through the projects?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. Some people do. We just did a talk 2 weeks ago for the Australian Landscape Conference, which is more around garden design and that kind of thing. And you could absolutely coppice your own plants like this. Probably in a garden setting, though, you wouldn't do everything. You might be a bit more selective, just like, you prune selectively. And look, in my own garden, much to probably people's disgust, I grow a lot of exotic plants, but I also have plants like Indigofera australis, and that as a coppice plant is the most beautiful plant in a perennial border. It's amazing. It just becomes this huge, massive flowers like a wisteria, and so I coppice that for that reason. The other place that people tend to experiment is if they've got a wide verge, they'll put in a woody meadow and coppice it that way. I guess on that, for a woody meadow to work from a design perspective, it does have to have a minimum width, like in the smallest dimension of 2 or 3 meters. Otherwise, it does tend to just look like a row of plants. But it can be as big as you want. Like some of the woody meadows we've designed are 5,000 square meters. They haven't gone in yet, but they are that big.
Yeah, fantastic. Amazing.
Yeah.
That is huge. Now I think you started answering this, but Meredy was late to the session, but is there any data I can use to encourage my local government to use this within public spaces and demonstrate the economic and resource savings of this method? So should we just, I think you've got a lot of that on your website and a bit more coming, but.
Yeah, we do. And I think, look, those guidelines, and I'll certainly share them with you. And I'm going to take Nat up on her generous offer to review them before we publish them as well, to, get a few other perspectives on it. But those guidelines will have all of this. So they'll have the cost. So for your information, they're about $110 a square metre to install. That's site preparation, plants, and planting labour. And then those maintenance charts will go in there as well. So yeah, it's always been our desire to put as much information out there so that people can't say no.
Fantastic. Yeah, it's awesome. Yeah, it's great to have that practical, information and be armed with it, and for community members to educate councils as well. Now, D. Neil has got 4 questions in one. I think we'll see how we take these. I think you've answered the first one. Do you use biologic microbial enhancements such as compost teas, that type of thing? So you did mention that you use some fertilizer at the beginning.
Yeah, and look, we don't tend to do anything around mycorrhiza or any fungal stuff and things like that. We do find with other work, we haven't measured it in this, but most of the time mycorrhiza and other beneficial fungi will come with the tube stock anyway, and there's so much in the air around that they colonize eventually themselves. But look, if it made you feel good to use it, then that's fine. It's an expensive additive, so we don't tend to.
Sure. Fantastic. Do you know approximately how much soil carbon sequestration you can achieve? Is that something that's been tested through this?
No.
Yeah.
No.
You can't do it all in one project.
And I think from that, you could basically just transfer whatever you would know from urban plantings more broadly, or from agriculture or forestry. I can't see that the numbers would be that different. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah. And just around the water issue, are there on the curbside plantings, are there examples of councils using their stormwater to help with watering and that type of thing?
No, but that's where we want to go next with a research project. So if any of you are interested, feel free to reach out. But we're thinking about putting together a grant to look at woody wooded, we're calling it. So woody water sensitive urban design, and how we can use woody meadows to diversify those, but also thinking about how you could do that in combination with street trees. Yeah, there's work on that in terms of street trees and passive irrigation through stormwater here already, but just thinking about the diversity of an understory as well.
Yeah, fantastic. And I think you clarified this, but in terms of when the coppicing process, there's a few questions around the coppicing, but do you leave the cuttings as mulch and that kind of thing, or is it all taken away?
No, you have to take it away, because if you leave it there, you're creating a site for weeds. So essentially it's taken away. You can mulch it and use it somewhere else, or you can turn it into biochar or whatever, but you can't leave it there because you then are setting it up to be not low maintenance. But one thing we are looking at in Sydney, which is interesting, because they have such great ranger teams with Indigenous people already, and they do cool burns in parts of, I guess, Western Sydney. We're thinking about whether we coppice a woody meadow, whether we leave all the cuttings there, we let the plants reshoot for a few months, and then we come through with a cool cultural burn to get rid of the material that's left. And that'll be really exciting. I'm looking forward to finding out what happens there.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, that relates to someone else's question around, what knowledge do we have about, Indigenous practices of coppicing or, use of fire. So that, that would be really interesting. Yeah, fantastic. And we've got some, great cultural burning sites happening here in Adelaide as well. So we can all keep learning together. Yeah. Fantastic. I've found another question over in the chat section. And there was a more general question around like there's obviously this focus is on urban greening, but has there been any work on looking at as an option for fire retardant gardens, or is that outside of your scope?
It's a question I do get every now and again, and I don't have a great answer for that because, a lot of Australian plants are flammable. And look, it's a really, really, really tricky one to answer. I think you'd have to have your I guess, your boundaries around the houses that you would. I suppose where they could be useful is that you could use this approach to make a really diverse shrub-based planting that stays under a metre, and so therefore you're not going to get the height that you'll get to make a big crown fire. But look, they will burn. Yeah,
it's always an interesting one. So I've got a couple more questions here. This is probably more about how you set up the great partnerships that you have with councils and that kind of thing. And have you had much resistance to, to specific sites or doing this type of planting with councils or with your state government partners and that type of thing? How have you worked that through to get, or have people just been interested and willing to experiment with you?
Yeah, I think, it's an interesting question, and there's probably two ways to answer it. That demonstration project that we had at Birrong Ma, if we hadn't had that, I don't think we would have had the partnership we had to start the grant. Because you can talk about it and people go, oh, yeah, that's interesting. But then you go and you feel it and you see it and you go, oh, wouldn't it be lovely if this was everywhere? And so we held, before we did the linkage grant, we held two workshops where we just invited everyone to come and hear about that project and hear what we found. And so we probably had 50 different stakeholders in the room. And then, as grants do, people can commit and people can't commit. We took the view that we wanted as many partners as we could, which wasn't what the research office wanted us to do, but we did because then it meant that the investment of every organisation wasn't huge. So we had, the partners put in between 16 and 40 grand for the 4 years, which isn't a lot of money. But having a lot of partners meant that we nearly got $1 million to do that work for the 4 years, which was fabulous. I suppose the other good thing is that everyone pays for their own woody meadow. And so they already have to kind of have buy-in before they approach us because they need to have had that funding through. But, and people have leveraged it in different ways, which is, wonderful. Some people might do it for an environmental outcome. Others are doing it for biodiversity. Some are doing it because they've got an engaged community they want to work with. So every woody meadow has a different reason for coming into existence.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, that's a very, dynamic and real way of how things work. But yeah, a fantastic way of showcasing the importance of gathering together as many different diverse partners as well. Well, we have just actually flipped over to 5 o'clock, which is when we commit to finishing our session. So thanks everyone for so many questions. And if we didn't get to your specific question, we'll make sure that that gets answered in the email. And Claire, thank you so much for your time in explaining the project. And we look forward to putting South Australia on the map with it as well. And I'm sure that there's people online today that will be interested in experimenting here as well. So please reach out and let's have a further conversation about it as well. So thanks so much, Claire. Yeah, beautiful.
Yeah, wonderful, pleasure. And if you want to filter any questions through with Christy or Nat, I'm happy to answer them.
Thank you so much. And so just before we go, our next session in the series is Get the Buzz on Adelaide's native bees, where you'll hear from Dr. Katja Hogendorn. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, Katja, I apologise. A senior researcher at the University of Adelaide next time to explore the fascinating world of Adelaide's native bees and a special project to bring back the golden PB to Adelaide suburbs. This is scheduled for May the 8th, so hope you will all join us then, and please take care and have a wonderful evening. See you next time. Thank you all so much for joining us.